Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It's Monday, July. I don't know what the hell day it is at this point. Why didn't I look this up beforehand? I forgot that I'd be needing the date, but this answers the question of how will I fill these 2 minutes, certainly. Yes, okay. You know what day it is. It's July 7th. It's Monday, July 7th. Of course it is, 2025. I am away from the desk. I am pre-recording this show for you, but I've started to hit the wall here. It's getting late. I need to start packing and getting ready. Remember, this is done long, long ago, and probably in a galaxy far, far away, at least mentally. And so today's episode will be one of those 1 hour specials, just to sort of keep you company and keep you up to date on a couple of things, or fill in some blanks that I think will be necessary for us to begin our work again tomorrow on Tuesday. But first, something completely unnecessary, except for the fact that we sometimes need a break from the current events, a weird historical piece that is essentially evergreen. In fact, it's so evergreen, I discovered that I had recorded this article, which was released on May 12th, 2024. I had recorded this thing for one of my previous trips and never got around to actually using it. We had so much content then, so I figured this was the time to bring it to you now. Are you ready for this one? Hold on to your hats. And then after that, we'll return to more or less current events just to get ourselves ready for Tuesday. Hey, how about a cool historical piece that I've been holding on to for some time now that's been parked in pocket waiting for, I don't know what exactly. This comes from way back in May 12th of this year. And I forget exactly how this one landed on my screen, but whatever it was, I lost track of it. But I thought it was a cool part of, or a piece of like lost history that my recollection, I'm curious to read it again because I forget the story now and why it landed on my desk and what the associations were that I made at that time. But there was something about this story that made me say, hey, this is relevant or provide some kind of interesting parallel to something. Of course, it could just be a cool piece of history that was lost. And maybe what struck me was, how could this have been lost? This was so integral to how we got to a critical period in our history, the Civil War. And I don't know. I certainly don't remember. So here I go. This is in The Guardian. I'm increasingly turning to The Guardian. I'm increasingly thinking I'm going to have to pay The Guardian for another thing, but increasingly realizing how often I have to turn to The Guardian to figure out what's going on in the United States. And they spell everything wrong. So it's really difficult. Well, anyway, this is written by one Martin Pengelly. Pengelly? I don't know. I think I've actually called that name before and wondered. Through the magic of after-the-fact editing, I am breaking in with this special report. I have just heard Martin's last name pronounced as Pengelly, and I think that's the pronunciation we should probably go with, although I don't think I'm going to be able to go with it in the rest of this recording. So now, back to your regularly scheduled flubbing of his last name. A Washington correspondent for The Guardian about a new historical book, a new write-up of the Wide Awakes. Do you know what the Wide Awakes are? And maybe this had to do with, is this the original Wokes? I don't know. Maybe that was it. But the Wide Awakes, the young Americans who marched the North to civil war. This is really kind of interesting and just curious history and curious how it would disappear. And also, I'm not entirely sure in my recollection now whether this was like, hey, they were on the right side of history, but are these people to be proud of or not? I am not real clear on that. Smithsonian curator John Greenspan is, I guess, the author of the book here, and discussing his dramatic new book about a spontaneous movement that helped elect Abraham Lincoln. That sounds like a good thing, right? But remember how radical Abraham Lincoln was to some significant portion of the country, even in the North. So helped elect Abraham Lincoln and frightened the slaveholding South. Good, righteous, right? Now my recollection is, well, hold on, just a second. I mean, the cause is righteous, but wow. Okay, well, let me read it this way. Have to jump back to the pocket version of it because this is a archived article over at The Guardian. But it starts out with a comment from John Greenspan here. History is really the only thing I can do, he says, smiling. I worked in restaurant kitchens. I did other things, but really history is it. If I ever have to stop, I don't know what I could do. It's like I'm a one-use tool. Okay, he's being modest, but he definitely does history. A Philadelphia native who studied at Sarah Lawrence in New York and got his PhD from the University of Virginia, Greenspan is now a curator of political history at the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. He's also the author of a new book, Wide Awake: The Forgotten Force That Elected Lincoln and Spurred the Civil War, which casts a bright torchlight onto a fascinating, if brief, episode in the 1860s America with strong echoes in the divided nation of today. Okay, now I'm starting to see it come together. The Wide Awakes were a political movement begun in Hartford, Connecticut around the elections of 1860, growing spontaneously and nationally as a way for young men to publicly support Republican anti-slavery candidates, most prominently Abraham Lincoln. And I'm starting to recall some of this now. Like, great, anti-slavery, we're definitely with that. I think what struck me when I was reading this was what was happening to radicalize young Republican men to come out in support of well, I'm sure to some portion of the country, we know, frightening prospect of a Republican president. The first one, of course. And now we look back on it differently. But, yeah, this movement, you'll see, my recollection of it is that it's kind of odd and weirdly militant and includes uniforms and marching with torches, which is now a problem for young Republican men who, by the way, would probably prefer to resume the institution of slavery at this point. So a little weird. Okay, so where were we with this? The Wide Awakes were a political movement begun in Hartford, Connecticut, as we said, around the elections of 1860, growing spontaneously and nationally. Young men coming out to publicly support Republican anti-slavery candidates, most prominently Abraham Lincoln. Now watch this. The members, they had uniforms. They wouldn't go this direction these days, I don't think, but members wore capes, often bearing a painted eye, E-Y-E, eye, carried flaming torches, which I guess was maybe a little bit less unusual looking than it might be now back then, but carried flaming torches and wore military hats and approximations of uniform as they marched in opposition to the slave-holding South. Now, of course, young Republican men march in approximations of uniform, sometimes with military headgear, let's say, and carrying flaming torches, but in support of the slave-holding South. Oddly enough. In his small Smithsonian office, after a trip to the museum stores to see a wide-awake torch, the last coffee cup used by Abraham Lincoln, and other precious relics, Greenspan describes how he found his way to the Wide Awakes. I guess it was through that coffee cup. I don't know. I always looked down on the Civil War as a teenager. That's an interesting thing to say. Maybe he was spending all his time thinking about the Roman Empire. But I looked down on the Civil War as a teenager because it seemed so cookie cutter and kind of hokey, very unhuman and dry. And then in college, we started reading Eric Foner, I guess, F-O-N-E-R. the dean of Civil War era scholars. Oh, I think it was about that. Oh, yes. And he made the factions in 19th century America look human, kind of tribal. I got into it from there. Oh, no, I'm thinking of a different story that we once read about how curiously racist northern professors chronicled the Civil War in such a way that they actually helped launch the lost cause idea. But I don't think this is what I'm talking about here. Unless I surprise myself and bring myself back around to that point. As a curator, Greenspan is responsible for telling the story of U.S. democracy, hence the giant cardboard pencil. How do you like that? In the corner, emblazoned with the words, "Write in Ralph Nader." Don't. But, if you're going to vote for him, I guess the write-in was the less threatening of the things. But as it happens, the evocation of the third-party candidate who maybe, it says here, cost Al Gore the presidency in 2000 points to one of Greenspan's driving interests, turnout. Now, Ralph Nader wasn't write-in in 2000, right? So this might have been one of the earlier campaigns. But the very fact that the name Ralph Nader comes up, I see. Well, when he learned how many Americans voted in the 19th century elections, particularly around the Civil War, that made me want to find out more. Turnout over 80%? What's the story behind it? And that kind of guided me to trying to find the human stories, and from there, it just seemed so exciting. Also, growing up in the 1990s and early 2000s, politics seemed so dry and tame in America. It was actually beginning to get terrible, but okay. Turnout was lower in the 90s than at any time since the 1920s. So looking back to the 19th century, when democracy seems so much more vibrant and engaging and conflicted, and I think you could drink at the polls, I got into this world that was completely different. And then, over the last 20 years, our world has come to look much more heated, for mostly negative reasons, so it feels like I got into something really niche that has become somehow relevant. I was going to say, the thing that was striking me here is the thought that, well, when you see voter turnout spiking past 80%, I assume it's because there's something really contentious happening, as opposed to, we're all very happy but love doing our civic duty. I don't think so. So anyway, next section here is entitled Guys with Torches in the Night. Greenspan found the wide awakes at grad school in need of an idea for my thesis. So I got into it and I essentially bombed all my classes the first year. They threatened to throw me out, but I just felt the wide awake story wasn't being told and I wanted to tell it. So I got pretty fixated on it. And I submitted a piece to the Journal of American History. And then, right when I was on the cusp of being kicked out, it always seems it is that way with the good stuff, right? The Journal said, we're going to run this in our Lincoln Bicentennial, which is in 2009. From there, I had some great professors who said, just be ruthless in doing the work you want to do. And, pat myself on the back, it turned into a career, right? Right. The wide awakes are known, but they flourished briefly before a civil war in which most were subsumed by the Union Army. Greenspan has room to move. There's a little scene in the preface of this book where a professor turns to his computer, goes on a newspaper database, plugs in Wide Awake, and gets 15,000 hits for 1860. Greenspan, not Greenspan. Alan Greenspan, he's asleep through this whole thing. Greenspan says, and yet the group had been so neglected. 15,000 hits in 1860, but then gone, right? It usually gets a paragraph in good books on 1860. They'll describe wide awake marches somewhere, maybe around the Chicago Republican Convention. But that was in May. And of course, a Republican convention. But okay, they're outside of the convention. But then you'll get 35 pages on the fight for the Republican nomination. And you'll get a biography of Edward Bates, Lincoln's attorney general, at 15 pages. But you have this mass movement, hundreds of thousands of people, and I'm going to get a paragraph. That is pretty interesting. I assume that means that even newspapers of the time, for some reason, were just dismissive of covering mass demonstrations, people marching in the streets. If you thought the opposition to the Iraq War was the first time that ever happened, I guess not. Greenspan thinks some neglect of the wide awakes comes from a little bit of elitism. History focused on great leaders. But the wide awakes aren't entirely a pretty story. And after the war, it's much easier to valorize Lincoln than to focus on the guys with torches in the night. Especially as we come to the conclusion that maybe nighttime torch rallies, not great. After the war and Lincoln's assassination, the Reconstruction years saw Ulysses S. Grant, the general who became president, face down the Ku Klux Klan, who were, of course, torch-bearing night raiders themselves, who terrorized black people in the southern states. But the wide awakes had a dark side of their own. Like the Republican Party, they emerged from a primordial soup of anti-immigrant feeling. These white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Republicans were pretty hostile to the Irish Democrats, and specifically Catholics, Greenspan says. The wide awakes in the 1850s are a nativist club. They are in nativist fights in Brooklyn and in Boston, I guess like gangs of New York, that kind of thing. If you see, or rather you see accounts from Irish immigrants saying, we stayed away from that group over there wearing the white hats because a wide awake hat was the symbol of the group. And then the wide awakes in 1860, not entirely separate, right? They take the same name just 4 or 5 years later. If you had started a movement called the Tea Party in 2015, people would have had associations. It's a lot of the same people. They're cheered on by the same newspapers, like the Hartford Courant, which is, or I hope we can say was, massively anti-Irish. But they grow out of it. I think they find a better conspiracy to fight. By 1860, the Southern grip on Washington was strong. The slave-owning states resisted change through an unrepresentative Congress, and a Supreme Court tilted their way. Now I'm starting to remember why the story was of interest. The parallels with Washington today are strong, though labels have changed, and it is Republicans who now pursue minority rule. You look at the behavior of the slave-owning elites, and they are doing everything they can to control Congress and control the Supreme Court to determine the future of the nation, Greenspan says. I like that in The Guardian they're able to just say it outright. Yeah, it's Republicans who pursue minority rule. You're supposed to, guess that yourself from American newspapers. But yeah, so interesting. And of course, the whole idea here is to determine the future of the nation. And by the way, the last time the Republicans did that, it resulted in civil war. But now, of course, they're doing that, and they are saying outright, we are looking for another civil war. Oh, no. Well, on the other hand, if they're looking for it, trying for it, planning for it, maybe it won't happen, because that's something that happens with Republicans, too. So, here we go, back with Greenspan. He says, it's kind of funny that we hate conspiracy theories, but every once in a while, there is one that's accurate, like this one, trying to control the future of the country. Another feature of Greenspan's book that echoes strongly today concerns Southern reactions to the wide awakes, which ranged from dismissive to angry to frightened. Particularly scarifying was the presence, remarkable enough in the segregated North, of black men among the torch-bearing marchers. John Mercer Langston was, as far as I know, the first black wide awake. He starts the club in Oberlin, Ohio, and then later becomes a Reconstruction congressman, a really prominent figure. I knew when I started the work on the wide awakes that there were black men involved, but I didn't realize how compelling this story was. A lot were fugitives from slavery. They connect the dots to underground abolitionists in Boston who were fighting the slave catchers in the 1850s. They come out publicly with the wide awakes, marching in uniform, 144 African Americans with 10,000 white wide awakes. They're not just claiming public space or claiming partisan identity. They're in military uniforms, a tiny minority in a sea of white people. It's a bold move. And those same guys, when the war breaks out, they organized the Home Guard and then organized the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, the most prominent African-American fighting force in the war. I see the wide awakes at a turning point there. And in the South, and you remember the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, the subject of the movie Glory, which is now 5,000 years old. So maybe you don't know it, but if you've been, flipping around the channels and perhaps seen it on as a TV movie somewhere along the line, then you know what we're talking about. And in the South and the Democratic North, people go crazy when they learn about black wide awakes. They start posting disinformation broadsides for black wide awake events. Wow, that seems familiar too. Real events in Pittsburgh and Chicago where we know there were no African Americans, just to gin up anger and get people to vote Democratic. Oh, boo-hoo. But, it's a weird situation way back when. But how do you like that? Disinformation for, fake events. That sounds pretty modern. And I kind of thought it was, even though I knew that the Russian active measures was an old idea. Still, I don't know. I kind of thought this was a new innovation of sorts to gin up fake events. Well, it all sounds familiar, evocative of right-wing fear and anger in the summer of 2020, when protests for racial justice spread and Trumpists, I like it, insisted shadowy black-clad anti-fascists, Antifa, threatened chaos and bloodshed. Rightly, Greenspan is wary of pat journalistic comparisons, like that one. Generously, he says the wide awakes were alarming to many. After the 1850s, when there's so much chaos in America, so much street fighting and bleeding Kansas and the know-nothing gangs, people marching in order in silence sends a political message. It's saying, we actually are the people in this republic right now who can organize things. The Democrats can't even stay together as a party, and we have matching uniforms. That's, I don't know if we all jump to the same conclusion, but I get the idea. They're not armed, but it's not a big jump from torches to muskets, as they always say. I could see them saying it, but I've never actually heard it. Lincoln's victory in 1860 was followed, of course, by Civil War, but it also caused the wide awakes to fade from the scene. Interestingly, you would think they would be on the rise at that point. Why? Well, this is interesting too. I remember hearing about this one when I read it the first time and saying, wow, okay. Members of the wide awakes wanted to escort the new president to Washington, but despite knowing of threats to his life, Lincoln turned down the offer, right? And wisely so. If he brings a bodyguard to Washington, like an outside unofficial one like this, Greenspan said, if he has 5,000 or 100,000 Republicans in uniform come with him, he drives away Democrats. He drives away Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, slave-owning border states. Prompted, Greenspan makes an apt comparison. I mean, January 6th. You can see how you can rile up your supporters, he says, of the day in 2021 when Donald Trump sent supporters, most in what passed for MAGA uniform, some in tactical gear, to attack Congress itself. When Mussolini marches on Rome, he brings his black shirts with him. There are so many examples of a leader mobilizing people this way, and Lincoln has the self-restraint not to do that. He puts it out through John Hay, his young secretary, to the young wide awakes in Springfield, Illinois. Go to Washington as individuals. Don't come as a company. If you want to come to the inauguration, that's fine. But there are still secret wide awakes in the crowd, and they have the uniforms on. Next section is titled, People Keep Finding Objects. Greenspan has ideas for his next book, which will be his fourth, and will continue to engage the public at the Smithsonian. Nonetheless, the publication of Wide Awake is a culmination of sorts of 17 years of consuming work. At first, I felt I discovered something no one else knew about, he said, and then I thought, I'm done. But people keep coming to me with more Wide Awake stuff. I wouldn't have written this book 5 or 10 years ago, but people keep finding objects. I still find references in diaries that I read. And there was a sort of neo-Wide Awake movement in the 2020s around protests for racial justice. That's good news. It seems Greenspan will never truly let go of the Wide Awakes. They're part of his job, after all. Downstairs in the conservation department, we approach another relic spread out to be viewed with care. And you really should see this thing. It's a photo. And it is a Wide Awake cape owned and used by George P. Holt of New Hampshire, and then stored in an attic for 100 years or more. Originally bright white with violet lettering. How interesting. It has faded and frayed with time, but the painted eye, arranged to stare from the wearer's breast, is as piercing as on the day it was made. That is pretty interesting and pretty amazing to look at. Weird. It must have been just odd. What an odd piece of uniform paraphernalia to have. And I don't know, a white cape seems odd anyway. And that is the end of the article. I know it feels like a kind of a rough stop to it. I want to learn more. Well, you can go and read the book, I guess. And I thought that was just kind of interesting and just a weird parallel in so many ways to what's going on, except in some places it's a mirror image and in some places it's right on the nose. And when I say mirror image, I mean, that could mean anything. Like, that's exactly like it was back then. Mirror image, except flipped, like what an image in an actual mirror. That's just coming from the other side this time. Very interesting. I thought you would find it interesting too. Now, to kick things off for today's current events section of our 1 hour special, it's time to head back to a problem we addressed a little bit last Thursday, the breakdown of the regular constitutional order, of course, and further explore it. And we begin, as we should in most cases, with Don Moynihan in his Can We Still Govern Substack. It's Congress Fights Back Against Congress. Right, they're supposed to be fighting back for their spending prerogatives, but instead they're fighting back against themselves. How so? Congressional Republicans, naturally, threaten their own institutions to protect Trump. This is Don's June 25th entry at Can We Still Govern? And it goes like this. The broad story of the second Trump era has been of two inverse and related trends. The growth of a personalist presidency, we've definitely discussed that, and the decline of state capacity. A system built on loyalty to one man cannot tolerate institutions bound by other values, and so it must break them. This pattern has been observed again and again, with some links and everything, in the executive branch, which is unsurprising. But now we see Trump's loyalists in Congress target their own legislative institutions for being unwilling to bend the knee. The latest, but by no means only example, is the proposed House Republican budget that would cut in half funding the Government Accountability Office, or rather, I guess, cut in half funding for the Government Accountability Office, the GAO. So that seems like a good idea at this stage of the game. We're for government accountability, but we're cutting the funds for government accountability in half. GAO is the nonpartisan, and that's the problem, legislative watchdog, and that's the other problem, watchdog, that gives Congress the capacity to investigate what the executive branch is up to. Can't have that. They might find out an answer, and that would put them in an awkward position. GAO does careful investigative reports on the topics that Congress determines are important. For example, Dodgy might have actually been moderately effective if it paid attention to GAO's high-risk series, documenting the biggest challenges to making the government effective. But why read any of that, right? The basic job of institutions is to defend their existence. Right now, Congress is failing to do that. You might think blind defense of outdated institutions is a flaw. Maybe sometimes, but not here. Congress, and more specifically congressional Republicans, have largely been Congress, and more specifically congressional Republicans, but Congress in general, has been largely acquiescent to Trump, failing its role as a check against an executive branch that badly needs checking, and it is now attacking the congressional capacities that allow it to fulfill its constitutional role. So, let's understand what's happening, and more importantly, why it is happening. First section up. Historically, Congress upgraded its capacity to check the presidency. Congress has generally sought to match the growth of presidential power with its own investments in capacity, albeit on a smaller scale. The Budget and Accounting Act of 1921 that gave the president the Bureau of the Budget also established the GAO. The Nixon-era conversion of the Bureau of the Budget into a more powerful Office of Management and Budget saw Congress create the Congressional Budget Office to upgrade its analytical resources. When Congress gave President Obama new spending authority with the stimulus bill, they also directed GAO to hire new limited-term staff to provide additional oversight. The congressional record is not perfect. Newt Gingrich killed off the Office of Technology Assessment in 1995, at a time when having legislative specialists advise about technology would have been a good idea. GAO picked up some of that work, despite also suffering from Gingrich-era cuts. The conventional wisdom is that Congress still lacks sufficient capacity. One reason for this is that legislative staffers, i.e., the people who work directly with members of Congress, are A, systematically underpaid, and B, do not stay in office long. This makes the permanent staff at places like CBO and GAO all the more important, since these organizations provide the resources and stability for staff to invest in building expertise and institutional memory. The next section, a short one. Congress used to push back against presidents trying to control its agencies. In general, congressional capacities have lagged the executive branch, but mostly Congress has tried not to get left too far behind. It has also resisted efforts by the president to undermine congressional independence. For example, when the GAO was first proposed, President Woodrow Wilson wanted to be able to remove its head, the Comptroller General. Congress said no. President Reagan pushed congressional Republicans to remove Alice Rivlin, the head of CBO, but Republican leaders refused. Next section, Trump opposes congressional oversight. Not surprisingly, presidents are often not a big fan of congressional oversight that finds scandals in their administration or disagrees with their budget or economic estimates. This basic pattern is an order of magnitude worse under Trump. Actual formal mechanisms of accountability are the enemy of a regime built around loyalty. This is why Trump has fired inspectors general and targeted general counsels for removal. Trump also believes he ought to be able to fire any official that displeases him, as he did with the head of the Library of Congress and leaders of independent agencies. What did CBO do to displease Trump? Well, it pointed out that Trump's big, beautiful bill simply does not add up. CBO has confirmed what independent analysis has shown. The bill is a regressive transfer of resources from the poorest to the richest that will cause a lot of people to lose Medicaid. What happened next? The White House launched a campaign to discredit CBO, saying it was run by Democrats. Never mind that the head of the CBO, Philip Swagel, S-W-A-G-E-L, is a former Bush appointee chosen by Republican lawmakers. What did the GAO do? What did the GAO do? Because we're switching from CBO to GAO. Now, it has investigated Trump's abuses of presidential power. In his first term, they pointed out that his impoundment of funds meant for Ukraine, which led to his first impeachment, was illegal. This conflict about legislative and executive power has become a full-blown constitutional battle in Trump's second term. Trump and his budget chief, Russ Vought, insist that impoundment is legal, and the GAO is pursuing dozens of investigations into Trump withholding congressional spending. As the GAO finds that Trump is again breaking the law, it embarrasses not just Trump, but the Republicans who control Congress for failing to do anything about Trump usurping their powers. What happened next? The White House said it would no longer cooperate with GAO investigations into whether it was breaking the law. That's a nice option to have when you stop viewing the law as a binding constraint or other branches of government as relevant. See also Trump officials ignoring court orders. The Trump administration also sent DOGE to take control of GAO, as it had with independent agencies. DOGE was sent packing, but the message was unmistakable. GAO had a target on its back. Next section, congressional Republicans are choosing Trump over their own institution and responsibilities. The Trump approach to congressional agencies are at once norm-breaking and unsurprising. You can see some echoes on the Reagan's attacks. Reagan's attacks on CBO for not going along with their unrealistic budget scenarios. What is different this time is the degree to which congressional Republicans are willing to make good on Trump's threats. Rather than side with their own institutions, Speaker Mike Johnson tried to smear CBO as unreliable and repeated the White House talking points. And now, GAO is in the crosshairs. Professor Phil Joyce, an expert on congressional agencies, noted the GAO had seen cuts before, but part of broader Gingrich-era cuts in spending rather than being singled out for punishment. And there's a quoted section here that says, GAO is in a very vulnerable position. It is clear that the motivation for cutting the GAO budget has little to do with saving money and everything to do with attempting to further harm the capacity of any part of the government to challenge what the administration wants to do, particularly with respect to impoundments. Next section is a quote that says, the title is a quote, "It is all about retribution." Indeed, it is incredibly clear the cuts to GAO are not about saving money. And there's some bullet points here. The overall budget request for congressional agencies is slightly smaller than before, but nothing like the scale of the cuts GAO would face. Some parts of Congress, notably the Capitol Police, are seeing large increases. The savings from GAO cuts represents 0.006% of federal spending, and spending on GAO generates large returns because of its focus on waste. In 2024, every $1 invested in GAO generated about $76 in financial benefits, totaling $67.5 billion in financial benefits. The long-term average return on investment is even better, $123 for every dollar invested in the past 6 years. I also asked Chris Mihm, and I guess it's Mihm, M-I-H-M, for his perspective. Mihm was the longtime managing director for strategic issues at GAO, and so knows the organization intimately well. He told me, certainly among the analytic arms of Congress, significant cuts are unusual because Congress sees the value in our work. The challenge now, of course, is, and IRS, SSA, USAID, NIH, etc., all face the same problem, is that the traditional arguments do not work. Business cases for increases or warnings about cuts are typically based on what it would mean in terms of mission performance and the ability to support the Congress with independent, timely, fact-based analysis. But when the clear intent of the cuts is to undermine all of that, claiming that cuts will hurt the agency's ability to support the Congress only reinforce the political reason for the cuts. I don't know how GAO can respond to this, since it is all about retribution and not deficit reduction, poor performance, or other arguments that you can at least respond to with data. Next up, the next battle, appointing the Comptroller General. Historically, GAO and CBO have been very careful to be responsive to both parties. So wiser heads might prevail, and there are multiple steps before the proposed cuts to GAO would be implemented. But even if the budget cuts do not happen, there is another route to politicize GAO. Historically, Congress has also cared enough about institutional capacity to pick credible and widely respected actors to lead CBO and GAO, but that commitment to competence may no longer hold. The Comptroller General is chosen by Trump from a list of names presented to him from Congress. That process will happen during the current Congress, and with GOP majorities, there will be strong pressure to find a comptroller who prioritizes not upsetting Trump. Trump and Vogt are very much aware of the importance of this pick and will try to shape the process. According to Joyce, the biggest risk here is the appointment by the president and confirmation by the Senate of a new comptroller general who has no interest in playing GAO's historical role of allowing the Congress to challenge the executive. This would be good for Trump, but bad for Congress, and really bad for the rest of us seeking credible, nonpartisan sources of information to shape congressional decisions. Mim echoed these concerns. Not to be over the top, he said, but with a 15-year term, the wrong comptroller general appointment could literally doom the agency. It would allow not just for no oversight for this term, but for weaponized, quote, oversight for any subsequent Democratic administration. A partisan loyalist leading GAO might be more willing to explicitly attack a president, but it would also be less credible, Joyce pointed out, saying, in the end, this is, in my mind, just another example of a short-sighted action by the Congress in acquiescing to the destruction of its own capacity. And even if I were a partisan Republican, I might at some point ask whether the credibility and the ability to allow the Congress to challenge the executive might be useful to me someday when there is once again a Democratic president. This is not to mention the fact that anyone who believes in the separation of powers should be alarmed at this attempt to weaken the Congress. A functional legislative body would be willing to set aside partisan differences to protect its long-term capacity to fulfill its constitutional role. This used to be the case, more or less, but it is no longer the case under current Republican leadership, especially on the House side. And why are Republicans, congressional Republicans, undermining Congress? To muddy the waters about deficit-busting wealth transfer from the poor to the rich, to block investigations of illegal presidential actions that usurp congressional power, to show fealty to a man who wants their institution to be wholly under his thumb. They give our institutions away so cheaply. And that wraps it up. Good points, well worth noting, and I guess, let's see, I'm trying to think of how it ties things all together. I mean, a lot of the previous articles were about impoundment powers, and you wonder why they keep surrendering on that. And the answer is they seem to be willing to surrender across the board, even up to cutting the agency that will tell them when the president is full of it and or lying to them, and trying to force them to pass bad legislation that won't achieve the policy goals or the savings that they think they want to achieve. And now they won't even find out ahead of time because they'll kill the agency that tells them that's the case when it's happening. Pretty wild. Guess these guys just don't fit into the founders' idea about the various actors in the various branches jealously guarding their own prerogatives. I guess you could just decide, I'm just here for the paycheck, man. That's all. Okay, this might not be the most lighthearted thing to add on top of Don Moynihan's commentary, but I believe it deserves mention, and I've got time to fill, and we're going to mention it. And it comes from the Washington Monthly and not from one of the usual suspects in this sort of alarmism. Jack Rakove, I'm guessing it, Rakove, and he's got a compelling enough headline and message, and I think it belongs in one of our broadcasts, and it might as well be this one. In fact, it's going to be this one. It's not just a constitutional crisis in the Trump era, it's a constitutional failure. Okay, bad news, right? The problem isn't just the crisis of the administration defying the courts. It's the failure of the legislative and judicial branches to check the president. We were just talking about this. This is a June 27th piece, again in the Washington Monthly, and it goes like this. The idea that the United States awaits some dread constitutional crisis has become commonplace. For lawyers, such a crisis would likely involve Donald Trump's administration defying the Supreme Court on some critical ruling. But other crises are readily imaginable. Might President Trump invoke the Militia Act to manipulate the 2026 congressional elections? Or order the Marines to take sites in Greenland without congressional approval, which seems ever more plausible after the June 22nd bombing of Iranian nuclear facilities? Such scenarios are not unfounded, but they do not diagnose our true malady. Our ongoing constitutional crisis began with the presidential election last November 5th. Re-electing an individual culpable for January 6th, who has twice made a mockery of the presidential oath of office, is itself a constitutional crisis. Nothing in his past or current behavior suggests that Trump has ever felt fidelity to his constitutional duties. Once a constitutional crisis becomes an endemic condition, the term no longer usefully describes our collapsing system. Instead, we live in an era of constitutional failure when the relevant institutions cannot fulfill their responsibilities. He's trying to move that window. It's already moved. He's trying to catch up with it. Because constitutional failure is a term we have never needed to use, it merits a precise definition. First, it must identify the specific situations where the government institutions have manifestly not fulfilled their constitutional functions. Second, it should treat these omissions not as occasional lapses, but systemic defects. Third, it must explain how the political and ethical norms of constitutional governance have evaporated. To apply this framework to the second Trump administration is hardly difficult. The only problem is where to begin. Consider its authoritarian reliance on executive orders to vitiate legally established government activities, its attempt to intimidate institutions outside of government to do its bidding, and its insistence that servile loyalty to the president outweighs fidelity to constitutional norms. That some commentators describe this last practice as the Führerprinzip, the Nazi principle that the will of the leader transcends all legal norms, tells us everything. I didn't know we were going to have to do German in this. Deciding whether the Constitution is failing requires asking if and why the other two branches of government have been remiss in checking a rogue executive. Their most important failures involve the two clauses that would have disqualified Trump from re-election, the presidential impeachment clause and Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. But starting in a more obscure location is better. The two emoluments clauses restricting the material benefits a president can receive from other governments. In his first administration, 3 suits sought to force Trump to comply with these two clauses. One, brought by members of Congress, was plausibly dismissed on standing grounds because a minority faction in Congress cannot litigate to make the body implement a power it already possesses. 2 other cases, however, progressed in the lower courts, but once they were appealed, the Supreme Court slow-walked them until Trump left office, leaving the issue moot. The court thus casually squandered an opportunity to clarify the meaning of a provision that badly needs enforcement. All previous presidents had scrupulously adhered to the emoluments clauses, which embody the fundamental principle that presidents should neither seek nor hold office for private gain. The honor of holding the highest office in the land should displace every other ambition. But this president and his family have more material, even sordid aims to pursue. With Trump, the imperial presidency and the presidential emporium have converged. This White House is for sale, whether through gifts from wealthy entrepreneurs, the manipulation of tariffs, and perhaps worst of all, the family's active involvement in crypto meme speculations. But the two emoluments clauses occupy only obscure niches in the Constitution. The same cannot be said of the powers being abused to eliminate federal agencies and departments and purge civil servants. These agencies and officials derive their authority from congressional enactments and appropriations. All are covered by the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, adopted to constrain the unilateral efforts of President Richard Nixon to reduce federal spending on his own authority. All involve the signature constitutional obligation of the president to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, not least because every statute requires either the assent of the chief executive or, in the case of a presidential veto, its reenactment by supermajorities in both houses of Congress. The most fundamental purpose of constitutional government, as it evolved in 17th century England and Revolutionary America, was to make the executive power susceptible to legislative control. It did not matter whether the executive was monarchical, ministerial, or presidential. The key point established by the English Glorious Revolution of 1688 was that the Crown had to rule with parliamentary consent or supervision. The executive could not arbitrarily suspend or dispense with enacted legislation. The royal suspension of law topped the list of grievances that the parliamentary proponents of the Glorious Revolution compiled in the Bill of Rights that accompanied the accession of William and Mary to the throne. As its first resolution stated, the pretended power of suspending of laws, or the execution of laws by regal authority without consent of Parliament, is illegal. A similar statement holds a prominent place in another famous declaration. The second allegation leveled against George III on July 4th, 1776, was that he has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. In Anglo-American tradition, the executive suspension of duly enacted law is prohibited. One would expect to hear Democratic members of Congress make this case repeatedly. Their silence on this point identifies one great political mystery of the day. Republican members cannot evade this accusation either. When audiences at constituent meetings repeatedly shout, "Do your jobs," they have a better grasp of Congress's responsibility than their feckless representatives. A similar argument applies to the rogue agency implementing this strategy. The Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE as we call it, cannot be a department in the conventional sense. It was not legally created as such. Instead, the obscure United States Digital Service underwent a radical mutation in name and purpose by executive order, from improving the government's use of technology, information technology, to decimating its agencies. Giving DOGE's scope, a naive observer would think its head would require Senate approval. The Senate did not assert that claim. Nor do many senators seem to believe this power over appointments is all that important. Their willingness to confirm the nomination of a recovered heroin addict and anti-vaxxer as Secretary of Health and Human Services, the head of the World Wrestling Federation as Secretary of Education, and a Fox and Friends weekend host as Secretary of Defense marks the appointments clause as yet another failure. Nor can the House of Representatives escape criticism for its dereliction of duty. The legal basis upon which Trump has launched his roller coaster policy of raising, lowering, and suspending tariffs is less than flimsy. As the recent decision of the Specialized Court of International Trade fully explains, the Constitution empowers Congress to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, with the House of Representatives initiating steps. Congress has authorized the president to modify tariffs only in urgent cases when an emergency exists. It cannot delegate the authority to levy a shifting and massive tax, that is, a tariff ultimately paid by consumers, to the president to impose unilaterally, another power the Stuart crown tried to wield arbitrarily in the 17th century. In the face of this congressional passivity, what path of constitutional repair is left open? Unsurprisingly, the best answer remains the courts. Although it has taken time to respond to the turmoil Trump has unleashed, the judiciary's actions have been encouraging. Remarkably, the difference between Republican and Democratic appointed judges has been slight, suggesting that judicial independence enshrined in Article 3 may be fulfilled amid this grave situation. I think this was a little premature, though. Yet, with the current Supreme Court, one cannot be too confident. Why? Its responses to the two 2024 critical election cases remain deeply troubling to anyone who takes the injunctions of the Constitution seriously, the court handled one case with striking expedition. But it manifestly stalled the other with a run-out-the-clock set of procedural delays that deprived voters of findings that they were entitled to possess before November 5th. The decisions in Trump versus Anderson, which involved the application of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to Trump's eligibility to appear on the Colorado primary ballot, and Trump versus the U.S., the presidential immunity case, should sit atop any hit list of constitutional failures. Two conditions define this failure. First, whatever its motivations, the Supreme Court majority simply refused to recognize the gravity of January 6, 2021, a date which stands as the constitutional counterpart to the surprise attacks of December 7, 1941, and September 11, 2001. Rather than focus on specific facts and constitutional aspects of January 6th, or confront the novel attempt of a sitting president to obstruct the peaceful transfer of power, the majority insisted, in Justice Neil Gorsuch's word, that we're writing a rule for the ages. In his opinion, Chief Justice John Roberts similarly observed that we cannot afford to fixate exclusively or even primarily on present exigencies or transient results. One can only wonder what makes some unforeseeable future contingency more urgent than the facts at hand. Law evolves not by dealing with imaginary contingencies, but by making sense of existing facts. The second condition seems more surprising. It is the stunning inadequacy of the majority's understanding of constitutional history and core concepts of American constitutionalism. In Trump v. United States, the Chief Justice emphasized the desire of the framers to create an executive who could act with vigor, energy, and dispatch. Any threats of being prosecuted for undertaking decisions requiring these qualities would weaken the presidency, thus providing a rationale for presidential immunity. That argument presents only half the story. The other quality the framers insisted on and valued higher than energy and vigor was responsibility, which is best defined in Article 2, requiring the president to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. That was the antithesis of what Trump did on January 6th, which is precisely why his prosecution should have been expedited, not prevented. The court similarly erred in its concern about Trump's indifferent willingness to put Vice President Michael Pence in danger. Here, the Chief Justice vaguely invoked the theory of separation of powers, stressing the close relationship between the president and the vice president, but this emphasis badly misstates their relationship. For much of its history, the vice presidency was not, repeat, not, considered part of the executive. The office's original sole constitutional function was to preside over the Senate. That was the capacity in which Pence was acting on January 6th. The real threat to the separation of powers on January 6th came from the outgoing president's depraved efforts to stay in power. The Supreme Court defaulted on its responsibility. Its duty was not to fret over future presidential prosecution, but to deal with the facts at hand so that the electorate would be fully informed before November 5th. By stifling the proceedings in Judge Tanya Chutkan's courtroom, the court made its unique and potentially lethal contribution to our failing Constitution. In our fractious polity, fresh insults to constitutional norms and settled practices of governance occur daily. That is why the phrase constitutional crisis no longer describes our situation. The Constitution has failed, and we no longer know which institution will rescue it. That is well put, strongly put, and really something to hear from Jack Rakove, who is the William Robertson Co-Professor of History and American Studies and Professor of Political Science, and by courtesy, it says here, by courtesy, amazing, Law Emeritus at Stanford University. He's an angry old man, I can tell you that for sure, and he's entirely right. Good point. Time to start shifting the language.
From netrootsradio.com, you have been listening to Kagro in the Morning. Waldman.
All right, I know it's only been 1 hour, but in my world and in my time, I'm exhausted trying to get this stuff pre-recorded for you. I am glad to have been able to keep you company at least for 1 hour this Monday morning. We'll be back live with a new show on Tuesday morning. Tomorrow, we'll see you then.